within Israel, there's a lot of, you know, subgroup cleavage. You know, in other words, they don't all just get along because we're Israelis, as you know. But it's a very fractionated political.
Well, obviously, we know there's a huge gulf between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis.
Yeah, that's the biggest
gulf.
gulf.
The Jews themselves,
there are huge.
There's a huge ethnic pecking order.
There are ethnic pecking orders, yeah. And one of the big stories, you know, you had the Ashkenazi Jews who established Israel, and were the dominant figures, at least through the 1960s.
Right.
But then you started to have the rise of the more Oriental Jews, and they are actually the majority now. They have a higher birth rate, and these Jews are more ethnocentric, they're more aggressive, and I think that's where they're, you know, that's the demographic base of the you know, Sharon's party.
Well, I want to get back to some of your intellectual movements, which is the essence of your book. We're going to start with the most famous one, perhaps, which would be Marxism, communism, as it were. What makes it Jewish? Because Marx and his core followers were Jewish. They led the revolution.
Well, I've tried to say that it's not enough just to find out somebody's Jewish. You know? I mean, if you talk about Einstein, Einstein led this revolution in atomic physics and so on. That doesn't make it a Jewish movement, because not only do the people who are at the top of it have to be Jewish, they have to, you know, they have to be pursuing Jewish interests in some sense. Now, there are times when there's some self-deception where we can tell, well, this person doesn't say he's pursuing Jewish interests, but we can see it. I mean, and that did happen, you know, with Jews on the left. But in general, if you look at the Jewish left, there was a sort of waxing and waning of Jewish support for the left, depending on how it was perceived as satisfying specific Jewish interests. For example, anti-Semitism. For example, you know, when the Soviet Union made this non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, there were a huge number of Jews that defected from the far left because, you know, what are these guys doing, making alliance with Hitler? You know, in other words, they still had a very strong Jewish identity. And same with attitudes towards Israel. When the far left, you know, when the Black Panthers and other people started to take pro-Palestinian points of view in the 1960s, Jews basically oftentimes abandoned the far left, and that's when the rise, what happened with the rise of the Podhoretz and then these various neocons that we see now are so important. Basically, it was because the left was not protecting Israel. There was a huge element of the left was pacifist. They were pro-Palestinian, you know, and so on. Well, that's not acceptable if you.
And that's why they've morphed. That's why so many Jewish intellectuals have morphed over to the Republican Party.
Absolutely, that is the historical source of the neocon movement.
Neoconservatism.
It's concerned that this sort of leftist foreign policy in the Carter, this sort of new politics that affected the Carter administration, McGovern, and all that they were not sufficiently strong in the Soviet Union, which by that time had become anti-Jewish. They were not strong enough pro-Israel. They wanted Israel to compromise. President Carter was putting a lot of pressure on Israel to compromise, to withdraw to the 1967 borders. Well, that's not acceptable if you're a neocon.
Now, how critical was the Jewish role, though, in the rise of communism? Again, during the, you know, preceding the Russian Revolution and after, even into this country in the 40s and 50s.
Ways yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult questions that there is of Jewish historiography. And I'm not entirely happy with what I've written on it, but I haven't seen anything else that I really like either. I think that it's extremely controversial, partly because it's one of those super sensitive topics, like the Holocaust, or, you know, that comes up. And it's very hard to see what's going on, really. But there's no question that Jews were radically overrepresented among the revolutionaries. And as soon as the Bolsheviks came to power, the Jews in Russia sort of gravitated to them because certainly their main agenda was to topple the Tsar. The Tsar was seen by them correctly as anti-Jewish. Now, I don't think he was as anti-Jewish as they thought he was. It wasn't, you know, life wasn't a horrible, unending disaster for Jews in Russia before the revolution. But it certainly wasn't great. He had some anti-Jewish laws and so on. And so if you look at the sort of international picture from 1880 to 1920, all the Jewish international organizations, you know, had their main agenda was to topple the Tsar.
What about the after the revolution in the United States? You know, we hear a lot about the the witch hunts and so on. What about the Communist Party USA?
Well, if you look at the far left of the United States, there's no question it had a Jewish backbone. Beginning, actually before that, if you look at the Socialist Party, Jewish neighborhoods in New York had, the socialist congressmen. They were very positive about the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Jews, many, that's not controversial. There's some things that are controversial. That's not controversial. That there was a huge involvement of Jews on the left of the United States as radicals and in supporting the Soviet Union, from the Socialist Party to the Communist Party. There's no question that that's the case.
But you say that the Jewish role has been sanitized to a great extent. Sanitized.
Well, I think now that that you've had the fall of the Soviet Union, and you've had the fact that the Soviet Union has acknowledged all these enormous crimes, that Stalin killed 20 million people by 1940. The police state nature, and that whole thing. Well, if you want to say that Jews were an essential part of it, which I think they were. I mean, my view is that without Jews, you would not have had the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. It would not have taken the direction it did. I think that's a reasonable point of view.
What about the 60s in this country, which you describe as a watershed, a cultural watershed in our country? Was there a pivotal, a vital Jewish element in what happened in the 60s?
Because Jews were still the main force on the left. And if you look at the Jews, at the people who were into top positions of the campus movements, I was at the University of Wisconsin, there's no question. They were the children of the 1930s radicals. And there was, the so-called red diaper babies. And, in collusion, again, besides the fact that if you look at these Jewish intellectual movements, you do see Jewish identity and Jewish interest. But the other thing is that these movements have always had access to the very top levels of the media, the very top levels of the academic world. So when the 60s radicals were saying and doing what they were doing, there was also a huge amount being written by radicals in the very best periodicals. They were very respectable, academic respectable. Look at, by that time, if you look at the very top universities, Harvard, Berkeley, all these Ivy League universities, University of Wisconsin, you had major Jewish involvement in the social sciences. And so that sort of greased the whole thing and made it much more legitimate.
We're going to move there in a moment. I just want to ask you some final questions about the civil rights struggle in particular here. For instance, the Southern Poverty Law Center is very conspicuous today as far as combating racism. Is there a Jewish angle to the work that they do?
Well, there is. I don't know exactly, what the involvement is, but it receives a lot of its funding from Jewish sources. Many of the people that work there are Jews. It's almost like a semi-official Jewish organization. It's not like the ADL, which is overtly Jewish, but it is very much concerned to combat anti-Semitism. So it's one of the main.
So was there anti-racism efforts focused on basically white racism, I presume?
Oh, absolutely. There's not
Jewish racism or black racism.
I've seen some people who've tried to change their focus because whites are increasingly the victims of ethnic violence in this country, and I think they will be increasing in the future as we see these demographic changes. The whites are going to be victimized at least as much as anybody else, and maybe more. But there's no interest in that kind of thing.
What about the NAACP? I know obviously that's a pro-black movement.
Yeah, it's a black
what's the story behind the founding of the NAACP?
Well, yes, early in the century, around 1915 or so, you did have the NAACP was established by wealthy Jews. And if you look at the, actually quite a bit of its activity involved legal challenges to various things, but almost all the lawyers until the 1930s there were no black lawyers involved in it at all.
In the NAACP?
And so all of that work for the first 20 years or so was done by Jewish lawyers. And you started to have some blacks, and finally around 1940s, I recall, I'm not sure that you had a black head of it, but you still had very major Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. Most of the civil rights laws were actually written in Jewish civil rights organizations and pushed through Congress and funded and so on. blacks were not well organized and well funded.
Sure.
They were poorly educated. Jews were just the opposite. And, so,
and Jewish liberals will tell you today they're very proud of their work.
They're very proud of it.
They did it for one reason. That was to increase the advancement and give more opportunities to African Americans. What do you say to that?
Well, but also I think their official ideology was that if blacks, if you end discrimination against blacks, you're also going to end discrimination against Jews. That was part of the official.
So that was part of, that was the covert agendas.
Well, it wasn't even. I think that's been acknowledged by many times. Mm-hmm. But I think the other thing about it was that they saw these movements as a sort of a, as if no one would lose. Mm-hmm. And I think the other aspect of these movements is that they have tended to lessen the power of white majority in this country.
No, and you think that was definitely
especially in conjunction with immigration. Mm-hmm. But certainly the civil rights movement, a lot of that, I think very few people could disagree with. But at the same time, when that was combined with immigration changes, I think you're seeing a gradual lessening of the power of European-derived peoples in the United States. And I think that is another one of the agenda. If you look at when it comes to immigration, there's no question, because the Jewish activists have expressed themselves on this day. They're not, again, they haven't been shy to make that point.
Right, we're going to get to that in a moment, too. Yeah. But I do want to ask you, now here's another thing that we both agree that there's been a jump from a lot of the Jewish community from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, because you think it serves the state of Israel being very well served by the Republicans. But here's a quote that I took out of your book, and the neocons are in charge of that process within the conservative ranks. You say that self-deception and rationalization are central elements of Judaism as a group evolutionary strategy.
Well, yeah, it comes up at times, and other times it's not. I mean, I don't say that Jews are always self-deceived or always rationalizing, but I have a chapter in my book, Separation, and it's just condensed the one on anti-Semitism. Just going over historically, looking at all the apologia, all the rationalizations. I mean, because Jews, as a minority group, they've had to deal with Christian ideology. Certainly within Christian theology, Jews had a certain subservient role to play. Well, you have to get around that. You have to have rationalize your particular theology. So it's been a part of Jewish thinking forever. If you look at over history, look in the Talmud, you look in Jewish writings, they've been concerned to justify themselves, to sort of make sense of their position in the world. And a lot of times, from today's standpoint, it's pretty easy to see it's rationalization. It doesn't make any sense, but it serves its purpose to rally the troops. But you still see it today. You still see some of that. Mm-hmm. I don't know that that's centrally involved in neoconservatism. I think that neoconservatives have been fairly upfront about the fact that Israel is a very high
but let's say they're going to war banging the drum, stop terrorism. So
we see that. That is for public consumption. I think that there is a lot. I mean, and there's a sort of official, quite a few people, including myself, think that the philosopher Leo Strauss, that was one of his, his principles, that it was okay to tell lies for a good cause, and so we see propaganda and so on. But I think that the main Jews behind these things have not been self-deceived. I think they've known what this is about. It's possible. Who knows? It's hard to decide.